March 17, 1943. A single fact lay on a mahogany desk in Tirpitz Sufa. The Ford Willow Run plant was building a 4-engine B-24 bomber every hour. The folder hit Admiral Wilhelm Canaris's desk with such force that coffee sloshed and trembled across pages that, if found, would mean death. For a man who had spent decades shaping facts into policy, the numbers inside were intolerable. They did not fit the story the Reich told itself. Canaris read rivet counts and aluminum manifests, looked at grainy photos of a mile-long belt of steel and flesh, and felt a quiet panic that had nothing to do with artillery. This was arithmetic against ideology. It was not a map to be redrawn. It was a calculation that erased a plan. Men like Karl Koller and Friedrich von Böttischer had warned before, only to be met by Hermann Göring's contempt. Now the proofs arrived from Mexico, Spain, Sweden, and smug telegrams, from napkin sketches, diplomatic receptions, and intercepted cables. The data converged. A factory the size of a city, employing women, black workers, and boys in precise repetition, could outbuild an empire. What followed inside the rooms of power was not a debate over production rates. It was a test of courage. To admit the truth was to call into question a racial doctrine, to accept that the enemy's democratic industry could outstrip German skill. To speak it aloud risked the label defeatist, with the Gestapo listening at the door. Canaris and his analysts understood the math. They also understood the cost of saying it. This is the story of men who counted a coming defeat and could not make their country listen. It is the account of small acts, a napkin, a film reel, a saboteur who surrendered, that carried proofs the leadership would not accept. How does a nation die not from lack of spies, but from the refusal to hear them? Keep watching. The proof was everywhere. The consequence of not believing it would be fatal. March 17, 1943. A single paragraph of arithmetic landed on Admiral Wilhelm Canaris's mahogany desk and changed the shape of his life. One bomber every hour. Not a boast, not a rumor. A steady, brutal rate. A 4-engine B-24 Liberator, completed and rolled away, hour after hour. The folder slapped down with force. Coffee sloshed over the rim of Canaris's porcelain cup and stained pages that, if the Gestapo ever saw them, might mean a cell or a bullet. He stared at the soaked corner as if the stain itself could tell him what to do. Canaris was not a dreamer. He had been trained to turn facts into decisions and decisions into action. He had built networks, read men's faces, counted whispers. Now his files held numbers that did violence to the story the Reich told itself. The report named rivet counts and sub-assembly timetables. It spoke in aluminum manifests and freight car inventories. It described workforces by the tens of thousands. These were dry particulars, the mechanical language of industry. And they were, in the cold limit, incontrovertible. They did not admit spin. He looked out the tall windows of Abwehr headquarters and saw the black ribbon of the Landwehr Canal, where 24 years earlier Rosa Luxemburg's body had been dumped. Berlin always kept its dead close to its living history. Canaris felt like one of those dead facts returning to the surface. He felt the building pressure in his chest that is not fear of bombs, but fear of being right when right means disgrace. There was a name for telling truth that unmade the regime's myths. Defeatism. There was a fate for defeatists. The men who had first tried to tell the Reich about American output had been met with a kind of laughter that was worse than mockery. 2 years before, Luftwaffe generals had sent figures from Washington suggesting that American aircraft production was swelling toward 2,000 planes a month. Hermann Göring had laughed out loud. He called them fridge builders and blade makers, said democracy wasted skill, and pointed to race as if biology could explain industrial law. It is important to understand that when a regime's doctrine tells it what the world must be, numbers that contradict the doctrine do not merely disagree. They are false by definition. This is the mental trap into which Canaris's file had fallen. Major Friedrich Wilhelm Heinz stood at attention across from him, a soldier shaped by routine. Heinz had triple-checked the source lines. The figures had been traced through Mexico City networks, through diplomatic cables, through casual talk at receptions, where men got drunk and confused the meaning of a factory for a story to impress admirers. Each account was different in voice and idiom, but the skeleton was the same. A massive plant organized into sub-assemblies that converged on a moving line, workers trained in days rather than months, Tooling bought and tailored to single operations, an army of hands, women, black workers, even boys, doing the same task over and over until the machine was complete. The rawness of the detail made the claim harder to dismiss. This was not bravado, it was work. Canaris held the report like a guilty thing. The arithmetic was simple and pitiless. If a nation could convert industrial capacity at this scale, then time became the enemy. He had been an intelligence man long enough to see the logic through. If one plant could produce hundreds of heavy bombers monthly, then the Luftwaffe's air defense, calculated for a lesser opponent, would be overwhelmed in months. The numbers were not a prediction, but a sentence. If these numbers are correct, Oberstleutnant Nikolaus Ritter told him in a low voice later, then Germany has already lost the war. It is a question only of mathematics and time. Ritter, a former Lufthansa pilot who had watched New York's skyline rise in the 20s, spoke as a man who knew the rhythms of American assembly. A different voice from Berlin would frame this as a contest of wills. Here, in the Abwehr's dim quiet, Canaris knew better. He knew how the Gestapo's shadow could shorten a man's life. He had seen colleagues vanish for speaking truth that unsettled the narrative. To bring such a file to Goering or Hitler was to offer a scalpel and ask a butcher to use it on himself. Would the butcher use it, or would he call the scalpel forged and the messenger a liar? The personal stakes were corrosive. Canaris felt the slow private grief of a man who was watching his country harden into an institution that punished foresight. He also felt responsibility. If he concealed the numbers, he would be culpable in a different way. Inaction in the face of knowledge is a choice. If he revealed them, he risked being labeled treacherous and meeting the fate awaiting traitors. The choice was not between right and wrong, but between two kinds of death, moral and literal. Small details tightened his chest, the folder's smell of ink and oil, the way the paper creased where his fingers pressed too hard, the half-remembered laughter of Goering in the winter of 1941, the memory of generals waving aside estimates they could not make fit their preconceptions. He thought of the men who had collected the intelligence, agents in Mexico City transcribing dinner conversations, a Spanish military attaché in Washington who passed talk over cigars, engineers who had visited plants and returned with ledger lines burned into their notebooks. They had risked travel, conversation, and conscience to build a mosaic of proof. That mosaic was on his desk like a challenge. Behind every figure in the file there was a human face, workers at folding tables, women with rivet guns, drivers delivering aluminum by the carload, boys learning logistics, a factory floor that smelled of oil and hot metal and something like pride. That pride was the other blow. It undermined the Reich's core lie about the superiority of its chosen bloodlines. The arithmetic made ideology look not merely wrong, but absurd. How could a regime that had staked its soul on racial and technical superiority live with numbers that showed otherwise? The thought of that cognitive collapse made Berlin's rulers recoil. Better to deny the numbers than to dismantle a whole identity. Canaris's mind began to make small calculations of its own, not the kind that appear in armored reports, but the private math of a man with duty. If Willow Run could produce at such a rate, then the Allies' ability to replace losses, to mass formations, to drag war into a grinding rhythm of attrition would be unstoppable. The Reich could not outbuild a democratic industrial complex that mobilized all its population. That was the central terror. Not the bombs themselves, but the steady multiplication of them. 1,000 questions assembled at once. Who else knew? How many months before those factories' output would tip the scales? Who in our own command understood and chose to ignore? The room felt suddenly small. Canaris imagined the oak rooms where power sat and made choices. Göring's grand hunting lodge with its heavy table. Hitler's map room. The secretive offices where ideology became policy. Presenting the numbers, there would be a different thing than reading them in his office. There would be witnesses, theatrical denials, the risk of a spectacle that would not serve truth. The best proof might be a film, a photograph, a manifest, something that would wear down contempt. But to show such proof courted danger. Film, once circulated, could be declared fake. A manifest could be called a forgery, and the man who brought it would be called a traitor. The paradox hollowed him. He had become a conduit for truth in a place that feared truth. He felt the melancholy of a loser's perspective before the loss was official. The nation was still powerful on paper, still mobilized, still holding fronts and issuing orders, but inside the walls, the truth had already arrived, and no one would budge to receive it. That is a particular kind of loneliness, to hold a lantern in a locked city and watch neighbors pass by, eyes averted. He looked once more at the canal. The city had held enough secrets to drown. The folder lay between him and consequence. Outside, the world hummed, and factories, cafes, and rail stations carried on. Inside, a single piece of arithmetic separated possible salvation from ruin. Canaris understood that history would judge very differently the man who could bear to speak and the one who could not. He also understood something more private. The men who had fed him these numbers had no sacred texts to defend. They had only measurements and memories. They would go on telling the truth even if no one listened. That night, as men in grey coats clattered through the corridors and the Reich's propaganda proclaimed strength, Canaris made a decision he had already been making. He would not run to the oak table with accusations until he could not be dismissed as a pessimist. He would fortify the arithmetic. He would seek corroboration that could not be so easily waved away. He would bind numbers to images and images to sources. If the regime refused to hear, then he would give it no excuse. The next step would not be a single act but a haul across oceans of gossip and ledger sheets, napkins sketched in Mexico, conversations in Madrid, cables from neutral posts, men who had stood on American factory floors and counted the pace with their own eyes. The danger was not only for the Reich, the danger was for him and for the men who had the courage to count what they saw. Could a single man's evidence move a system addicted to its myths? Could arithmetic break ideology's hold on a people? Canaris sat with that question like a man on a cliff edge, knowing the answer might mean his death, and knowing silence might mean millions more. On the desk, the stained corner of the report dried into a dark crescent. It looked like a wound. He put the file back into its folder, smoothed the leather, and began to plan how to make a fact that frightened the powerful into something they could no longer dismiss. The plan would require courage, and courage in that city had a currency. It was bought in whisper and risk. He would need both. March 17, 1943, had broken into facts that would not be soothed by slogans. Canaris had the folder, but the folder did not stand alone. It was the center of a spiderweb of small truths gathered by strangers and diplomats, by bored businessmen and curious engineers, stitched together by agents who risked far more than ink. The story of Willow Run did not arrive as a single thunderbolt. It arrived as a chorus, a napkin sketch in a crowded reception hall, a proud factory chief talking to a foreign colonel, an engineer's notebook full of tooling counts, an intercepted cable in strange code. Each voice sounded ordinary. That ordinariness gave the truth its force. In Mexico City, at a German-Mexican Commerce Association reception, an American oil man named Harold Morrison had too much tequila and a careless bravado. He drew on a napkin and spoke in a tone half boast, half wonder. They have 42,000 workers. It sometimes rains inside the factory from the skylights and the steam. They move the airborne sections like rivers. Wings from one place, fuselages from another. They train workers in days. The napkin sketch looked like the sort of thing you see in a startup founder's notebook today. Crude circles and arrows, a flowchart for mass-making. It was not romantic, it was methodical. Morrison did not think he was committing espionage. He was telling an amused audience about an industrial miracle he had seen. That casualness made the report more credible, not less. A few weeks later, a Spanish military attaché in Washington, Colonel José Hungría, would carry a different kind of proof back to Europe. At a reception in Buenos Aires, he met Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief and the man who had reimagined the bomber as an assembly line product. Sorensen spoke like a craftsman who had found a new tool. He described moving the aircraft past stationary workers, designing machines to do single operations, and building apprentice schools that could train thousands each week. He spoke of women making up 40% of the workforce and of 16-year-old boys running supply logistics. For a regime that measured people in myths and hierarchies, Sorensen's plain talk was blasphemy. It suggested that industrial discipline, not blood, was the decisive factor. The technical specifics were the anchor. A Swedish engineer named Erik Lundberg, who visited Willow Run in March 1943, filed a report that read like a balance sheet. He counted specialized machine tools, more than 1,000, and estimated tooling investments in the hundreds of millions of dollars. He noted the rail sidings that brought in aluminum, the freight cars standing like quiet witnesses, the parking lots full enough to suggest 3 shifts. A Japanese signal intercepted by German translators told a similar tale. One plant outproducing entire national industries. These confirmations came from neutral channels and unlikely witnesses. They were not propaganda. They were observation given by people who had no stake in the Reich's myths. That multiplicity of sources is what eventually caught Canaris's eye. Oberstleutnant Nikolaus Ritter, who had lived in Manhattan before the war and watched the city build itself skyward, was the man who turned chatter into mathematics. Ritter did not ask whether it would be embarrassing for Germany to be outbuilt by Americans. He asked whether the arithmetic closed the doors on strategic options. He laid out the steps. Sub-assemblies converging on a moving line, 60,000 discrete operations per aircraft, tool investment, worker counts, shift patterns. He could feel the geometry of production in his bones. For him, the numbers were not threatening because they contradicted ideology. They were threatening because they were sufficient. It is only a question of mathematics and time, he told Canaris. That sentence is not drama. It is the voice of someone calculating failure and knowing the sum does not add up in their favor. The sources were as human as they were technical. Georg Nicholas ran the Abwehrs network in Mexico City and cultivated relationships with businessmen who traveled from Detroit to Mexican oil fields. These men were not spies in the cinematic sense. They were the kind of people who chatter at dinners, trade gossip in hotel lobbies, and feel proud to describe the machines they have seen. They spoke about 60,000 separate operations, about women learning hydraulic lines in days, about specialized jigs and fixtures Ford had commissioned. A pattern revealed itself. The scale was not a one-off, it was a method. The factory's secret was not secrecy, but organization. Think of your smartphone, brought to life by a line of hands and machines. Think of your morning coffee made by people who perform the same movements again and again to make you a small ritual possible. In our lives, we accept complex systems of production every day without marveling at the scale and precision. Willow Run was no more magical than that. It was the same human habit magnified. Divide work, repeat, refine. That banal truth was terrifying because it collided with a grand falsehood, that some peoples were innately superior at complex work. Ordinary people's patience and rhythm beat ideology. The mosaic grew stubbornly precise. Sorensen, by his own account, had sketched a plan of production that sounded like a car plant adapted to an aircraft. He spoke proudly of cutting man-hours from 180,000 per aircraft to a fraction via flow lines and special tooling. He emphasized apprentice schools that could churn out thousands in basic competencies. He cited female workers' nimble hands as an asset for riveting tight spaces. These were not platitudes, but production strategies. To see a woman take a rivet gun and make the same motion all day with the speed of muscle memory was to understand how scale appeared from repetition. That image, a woman in overalls and ear protection driving a rivet into a wing spar, haunted the Germans who watched the reports. It destroyed a core belief by example. Small risks carried weight. Francisco Franco's Spain became an information highway. Colonel Hungria's chats, a Spanish diplomat's aerial photographs and diplomatic pouches moved film and manifests that could not be explained away easily. Each piece added a new kind of pressure. A parking lot counted by an analyst implied 3 shifts. A manifest for £16 million of aluminum for a single plant could not be forged on a whim. The discipline of accountants and the seriousness of engineers forced the data into a form of truth that words alone could not. But the testimony carried emotional freight too. Stories of workers sleeping in cars between double shifts, of wives learning rivet patterns because their husbands needed men at the front, of teenagers taking pride in logistics, of black and white hands working side by side, upset the German psyche in ways that pure numbers could not. For a regime that preached hierarchy, the sight of diverse hands building a lever for the skies was an affront. There was shame in watching opposites succeed where one's doctrine predicted failure. Shame is a powerful silencer. Agents risked capture to deliver this clarity. They transcribed casual dinner talk in hotel lobbies. They smuggled film via neutral embassies. They intercepted Japan's coded messages and fed patterns into the calculus. The human cost of collecting the truth was real. Men who traveled, who used charm to get counts, who listened while others bragged. Those spies became the invisible chorus that could have warned the Reich, if the Reich could listen. Yet even with multiple confirmations, the truth had a strange softness when it encountered power. Numbers alone do not have the force of law when they clash with an identity baked into speeches and uniforms. The Abwehr could lay out a napkin, a manifest, a tooling invoice, but to translate fact into policy required a different courage. Canaris felt that conversion as a moral test. He could present arithmetic until it stung, but he could not force belief upon men who had invested their honor in different stories. This is why the mosaic mattered. It was not merely technical evidence. It was a moral instrument aimed at a closed mind. Each napkin, each interview, each photograph accumulated like pebbles at the base of a dam. Eventually, many small stones might destabilize it, but dams do not collapse at once, they leak first. That slow, insidious seepage, disbelief until it can no longer be maintained, is what Canaris hoped for. He needed a piece of proof that could not be politely mischaracterized, film with clocks on the wall, manifest ink that matched rail schedules, photos showing completed aircraft waiting for delivery. He sought a kind of clarity that would embarrass denials into silence. Imagine trying to tell your boss that a system is failing while everyone in the office believes the system is success. You bring spreadsheets, user complaints, and performance graphs. You risk your job, your standing, perhaps worse. It is one thing to say facts in private. It is another to turn those facts into a public accusation against a foundational myth. Viewers know this. We have all watched a colleague ignore data or a family member refuse an inconvenient diagnosis. The human cost of telling truth in an organization that punishes dissent is universal. Canaris and his agents were simply living that cost at the scale of nations. And yet, for all the careful gathering, there were moments of absurdity that cut through the tension. At a reception in Mexico, Morrison had joked about it raining inside the factory, and the joke became a piece of intelligence. Sorensen, in a room thick with port and cigar smoke, had smiled as if describing a new machine, and not a turning point in history. Those human moments, the laughter, the napkin doodle, the pride older men take in a job well done, are what made the evidence persuasive. People do not lie about things that surprise and delight them. They trumpet them. That was the Abwehr's advantage. The truth came from witnesses who had no reason to conspire. The mosaic's danger lay in its contradiction to power and in its ordinariness. The Reich's story required exceptional enemies and exceptional workmanship of its own. Willow Run offered neither. It suggested instead that ordinary men and women, working methodically, could achieve industrial surges that no doctrine could predict. For Germans who believed themselves uniquely fit to command industry and war, the idea that a democratic society, messy and diverse, could outproduce them was unbearable. Canaris tightened the web by forcing corroboration. More interviews, more photos, more manifest checks. He asked his men to trace freight cars, to count cars in parking lots, to tally rivet patterns. Each new confirmation reduced the space for denial, yet every new piece of evidence also raised the stakes. If he took the mosaic to Goering and was dismissed, the mosaic would exist for nothing. If he kept it secret, he would carry a burden that would weigh the same as complicity. The choice flickered between moral clarity and political self-preservation. Before he moved, before he risked the confrontation that could cost him and those who told him the truth, Canaris required one more thing, something so simple and so brutal that it could not be waved away. Film of the working line, moving at pace, with a clock on the wall. If men could deny numbers, they could more easily deny documents. They might call manifests forged or napkins staged. But a moving image that showed men and women at stations, a clock revealing the cadence, would be a kind of truth that resided in time itself. What the Abwehr had assembled was not a conspiracy, but a slow, patient unmasking. They had gathered ordinary talk, technical notes, tool lists, and photographs to build a case that could not be swept aside as rumor. The question that now sat on Canaris's desk was not whether the mosaic was right. It was whether the men in power would let themselves be convinced by evidence that humiliated their doctrine. Would they hear arithmetic when it rendered their myths bankrupt? Would they accept that diversity, training, and logistics could defeat a creed of superiority? The answer felt precarious, like the last brick of a bridge that might or might not hold. If you want to follow how this unmasking forces a collision with power, how napkin sketches and intercepted cables become a threat to a regime that must deny them to survive, subscribe by clicking the red button in the corner. Join others who want to see truth faced, not hidden. Hit the button now and stay with us. What happens next will show how a few documents and a handful of witnesses can become the most dangerous thing in a country that fears its own arithmetic. Canaris closed the file for the night, but the chorus of evidence did not stop singing. Voices from hotel lobbies, engineer notebooks, and intercepted telegrams continued to reach into his office like persistent callers at the door. The echo of ordinary talk had become a verdict in waiting. The problem was not collecting truth anymore. It was making those who had chosen myth listen. The next act would be the hardest, taking the web of ordinary proofs and laying it bare in the oak rooms where denial practiced its most elegant forms. April 20th, 1943. Canaris traveled to Karin Hall with a burden heavier than the slender leather folder he carried. The Reichsmarshal's hunting lodge smelled of polished wood and old tobacco. The oak table in the center looked like a confessional where power confessed nothing. Canaris laid out photographs, manifests, intercepted cables, and the napkin sketches that had arrived from Mexico and Madrid. He placed them like cards on a table that had always been used to show strength. The numbers were clinical: aluminum tonnages, parking lot counts, rail manifests, and they made a case that could be read by any engineer. He watched Goering, a man of theater and appetite, scan the pages with the impatience of someone who wanted a story, not a summons to rethink his world. Goering did not offer technical counter-arguments. He offered laughter and narrative. He took a photograph of the long assembly line and declared it a staged set, a wooden mock-up made to fool foreign eyes. He looked at an intercepted railroad manifest showing millions of pounds of aluminum and sneered, "Where do they get this aluminum?" His answer was not a data point, but an insult. The product of Negro riveters and women riveters, the work of a democracy that could not possibly match German genius. The room filled with a peculiar quiet, an absence of argument where argument should have been. The dossier required arithmetic. The Reich offered myth. Canaris felt the air tighten. He had expected recoiling, perhaps ridicule, but not this deliberate reframing. The defense was not against the figures. It was against what the figures implied about identity and authority. To accept that a democracy could outproduce Germany in heavy bombers was to admit a structural weakness, that Germany's racial doctrine had blinded its industrial policy. That admission had costs. In the Reich, costs were paid with reputation, exile, and sometimes with life. Canaris weighed his duty to truth against the likely personal price of speaking it aloud, where denial was salutary. A week later, he would show the same material to Hitler. In the Wolfschanze map room, with Goebbels and field marshals present, the reaction was a theater of impatience. Hitler did not need arithmetic to dismiss what he had learned. He needed an enemy. He said a bomber was not a car, and that Americans were competent in mass goods, but not in precision war machines. It was an easy, rhetorical stroke that returned the argument to the familiar script. The generals worked the margins. Jodl and Keitel tried to quantify, to reduce Canaris's numbers by fractions until the totals fit a manageable reality. The conversation became arithmetic in service to faith. Figures were accepted if they could be divided down to a tolerable lie. How do you persuade someone who prides himself on certainty to accept a truth that lessens him? Back in Abwehr headquarters, with the film reel smuggled through Spanish pouches in his hands, Canaris and his deputy Hans Oster sat in a locked room and watched 5 minutes of a mile-long production line run past a camera. The film showed men and women at stations, wings and fuselages moving, a clock on the wall giving the cadence away. It was simple evidence: motion, rhythm, time. When the reel stopped, Oster whispered, "It's true." Canaris did not rejoice. He lit a cigarette, watched its ember, and then, in a desperate act of self-preservation, burned the film. They destroyed the best proof they had. Why destroy a document that proved them right? Fear. Fear that presenting it would only convince a paranoid regime to brand them falsifiers, traitors, and slanderers. A burned reel could not be used against them. A circulated one could mean the end. The burning of that film is a paradox that stings. It is the moment when knowledge becomes a liability rather than a weapon. The men who had put their lives at risk to get that footage understood what their leaders would do with it. In a system where the accusation of defeatism could kill, sometimes truth must be sacrificed to keep the truth-teller alive. That self-censoring gesture changed the arc of the war. It prevented incontrovertible proof from ever reaching the people who might have had to act on it. It was a cold calculation. Better to preserve a career than to risk a life for a fact that would be denied. The moral cost was not immediately visible, yet it would be paid in cities set aflame and lives lost. What happens to a nation when those who know cannot show what they know? Inside the halls of the Reich, the rejection of the Willow Run evidence was not merely stupidity, it was a psychological defense. Accepting the data would mean opening a doorway to shame and panic. Leaders chose denial because denial preserved identity. They preferred a comfortable fiction to a humiliating truth. But denial carried consequences beyond personal ego. When you refuse to update plans because the facts contradict your myths, strategy becomes a theater of acting. You make decisions to uphold narratives rather than to secure survival. It is a slow, bureaucratic suicide. The emotional calculus of the leaders was simple and devastating. To admit being outbuilt by a democratic, diverse workforce was to admit error in the premise of superiority. For men who had constructed authority from rhetoric and parade ground displays, the loss of that edge was intolerable. They could not see that admitting error and altering strategy would save lives. Instead, they chose coherence over correction. They reshaped facts so they no longer provoked existential questions. The science of denial is older than any war. It is the social glue that holds groups together when reality threatens them. Canaris left Karen Hall with the same piece of paper and with the smell of cigar smoke in his clothes. He understood that facts could be collected in abundance, yet still be powerless. He had seen how power turned data into theater, how laughter and performance could neutralize deadly arithmetic. He also saw something else, the faces of the men who had risked telling him the truth, the engineers, the diplomats, the casual American who doodled on a napkin in Mexico City. They had trusted ordinary honesty more than they trusted ideology. That trust had been betrayed by those who needed it most. If denial was a fortress, then those who bore witness were its underminers. But undermining a fortress by telling truth required courage. It required the belief that a leader might one day put conscience above image. The problem for Canaris and his circle was that the men at the top had invested identity in being always right. When facts intruded, those men wielded social power to silence dissent. To watch this process from the inside was to see an organism repress its immune response until the disease spread uncontrollably. What choice remains to a man who knows his country can be saved by truth, but whose rulers will not accept it? The tension moved from moral to practical. Canaris could continue to gather evidence, build an irrefutable mosaic. Manifests, labor rosters, film with clocks, eyewitness testimony stamped with dates and rail numbers. He tried to translate authenticity into a form that could not be dismissed as propaganda. Yet even as he collected, the machinery of denial continued to grind propaganda into the public space. The Reich's propaganda ministers turned the world into a carnival of confidence. Facts that undermined that carnival were treated as treasonous games. And so the drama of Willow Run became not only a story of production and engineering, but a story of human choice. It became a story about what it costs a society when its leaders prefer myth over arithmetic. It became a story about the small, exasperated band of losers, men like Canaris, Ritter, and the saboteur who would later confess, who understood the truth and could not make their nation see. Their loss was early and private. They lost the moral authority to compel action. The country lost later and public. It would lose cities, men, and eventually the war. They had film, manifests, parking lot counts, and the arithmetic that rewrote strategy. They had nothing, finally, that could make the powerful accept a humiliation larger than themselves. The moment of presentation at Karen Hall was where evidence met the human need to be unchallenged. The burning of the film was the instant that verified truth was chosen to be invisible. That decision set in motion a chain of inertia that could not be reversed by logic alone. What would you do if you held a fact that could save millions but also seal your fate? George John Dash stepped out of a rubber boat onto the cold sand at Amagansett, Long Island, in the early hours of June 13, 1942, and the mission meant to prove America's weakness ended in confession. Dash had lived in the United States for 20 years. He knew factory rhythms, the chatter of foremen, the cadence of a production line. Sent to sabotage and to gather proof, he found instead a truth that repelled the Führer's men. The industrial scale he had seen made bluff impossible. Within days, he surrendered to the FBI. In interrogation, he said something that should have landed like a thunderbolt in Berlin. Canaris himself told me that Berlin doesn't believe your production figures. They think Willow Run is propaganda. Dash laughed, but the laugh was bitter. He had walked U.S. assembly lines and seen what repetition and tooling could do. He had tried to tell his superiors that Ford, which once produced a car every minute, could produce a bomber every hour. He was told he was a defeatist. Why did a government that collected such reports not act on them? That question would haunt German intelligence officers for the rest of their lives. The Abwehr had more than gossip. They had film smuggled through Spanish diplomatic pouches, aerial photographs brought by diplomats, parking lot counts, freight car manifests, and intercepted cables. In November 1943, photo analysts studied Spanish aerial images of Willow Run and found hard evidence. Parking lots with 12,000 cars implying 3 shifts, completed B-24s on the adjacent airfield, skylights revealing an assembly line with aircraft spaced exactly as described, rail sidings loaded with freight cars. Hauptmann Werner Zahn wrote that photographic evidence confirmed human intelligence and recommended immediate strategic reassessment. That reassessment never came. The men who warned the Reich did not speak only in anecdotes. Dr. Albert Speer, who understood industrial scale better than most Nazis, recorded his despair. On May 15, 1943, he wrote that if the Willow Run figures were even half true, Germany would face annihilation. The arithmetic stripped away rhetoric. Ford's peacetime production in 1941 was 1.1 million vehicles. Ford converted that capacity to bomber production. Dr. Otto Ohlendorf, trained as an economist and head of SD Inland, presented a stark calculation to Himmler in December 1943. He showed that at American rates, by June 1944, the US would produce enough B-24s alone to drop on Germany the tonnage the Luftwaffe had dropped on London in 1940, every single day. Numbers do not plead, they just mark a horizon. For Ohlendorf, the horizon was annihilation. Yet the Reich's inner circles chose disbelief as strategy. Canaris was removed in February 1944 for alleged defeatism and replaced by Walter Schellenberg, a loyalist who would not offend Hitler with inconvenient truth. This was not mere personnel change, it was a structural shift. Professional candor was excised. Experts who had risked life and career to count planes and rivets suddenly faced a culture where honesty could kill. The machinery of denial hardened at the same time American production found its stride. The consequences on the battlefield were swift and cruel. In February 1944, Operation Argument, Big Week, saw the U.S. 8th Air Force and the RAF strike German aircraft factories in a sustained campaign. For 6 days, Allied bomb tonnage over Germany outstripped what the Luftwaffe had ever dropped on Britain during the Blitz. Fighter pilots who counted formations reported hundreds of bombers in single formations. Adolf Galland told Göring plainly, "I've counted over 800 bombers in a single formation." The sky had become a new front where production translated directly into power. By June 6, 1944, the Normandy landings would see over 11,000 Allied aircraft overhead. The Luftwaffe could muster fewer than 300 fighters in response. What did it mean to be outproduced by a margin that cost you control of your skies? It meant cities burned, supply lines severed, and plans undone overnight. Willow Run's peak in April 1944 was itself almost obscene in its clarity. In 1 month, employees in 2 9-hour shifts produced 453 B-24s in 468 hours, 1 finished bomber every 63 minutes. The plant employed 42,131 workers, including 11,000 women, 26% of the workforce, 3,800 African Americans, 9%, and 1,200 disabled workers, 3%. The factory broke Nazi myths as cleanly as a punch through glass. Diverse hands, trained quickly, produced weapons that washed into Allied formations by the hundreds. The demographic facts were not minor details. They were nails driven through ideological claims of a superior race. For German officers who had studied these reports, shame gnawed at the edges of professional shame. The enemy was not an inferior mass. It was an industrial organism that included women, black workers, and teenagers, all turned into disciplined labor by apprenticeship schools and tooling investments. These were not small investments. Swedish engineer Erik Lundberg estimated tooling costs at around $200 million for a single plant. The Willow Run floor space was 3.5 million square feet. It consumed 16 million pounds of aluminum monthly and drew roughly 2.5 million kilowatt-hours a month. Comparisons used by German analysts cut deep. All German aircraft factories combined were 8 million square feet. Willow Run alone accounted for nearly half that, while American tooling outspent whole branches of German industry. The cost per B-24 fell from $238,000 to $137,000 as efficiencies took hold. Economic math and production geometry mattered more than ideology. They are what win wars. The tactical effects of this production were immediate. Allied air superiority stripped the Luftwaffe of trained pilots faster than they could replace them. German fighter production lagged because resources had been misdirected toward Wunderwaffen projects, towards prestige weapons, toward an industrial imagination that refused the straightforward arithmetic of assembly lines. That misallocation was not merely technical, it was political. When you believe that your myths are immutable, you invest in symbols rather than in the practical hardware that keeps planes in the air. The Reich, in short, fought its fantasies and lost. For officers and analysts inside Germany, the betrayal felt personal. They had collected, counted and warned. They had traced freight cars and written memos. Canaris and others had begged for rethinking, for allocation of fuel, aluminum and attention to fighter production. The response was often silence or mockery. The men who understood supply chains watched the sky become a ledger in which each bomber made a subtraction from their future. They watched towns incinerate under iron shoe formations and knew those losses were in part the product of a culture that refused arithmetic. After the war, Schellenberg and other survivors told the story. German intelligence was full of facts, but the regime's refusal to believe them was catastrophic. When the final accounting arrived, the scale was undeniable. Willow Run built 8,685 B-24s between 1942 and 1945. Total B-24 production reached 18,188. Total B-17s reached 12,731. The United States produced 303,717 aircraft from 1940 to 1945. By the simple measure used inside Abwehr circles, the United States produced roughly 3.2 times as many aircraft as Germany while fighting a two-ocean war. Those ratios are not abstractions. They are arithmetic with bodies attached to them, crews, bomber formations, cities leveled or spared. The factory that one German admiral could not believe turned out to be a crucible of a new military reality. There were human faces to the machines. At Willow Run, women who had never worked in industry took rivet guns and learned skills in weeks. They slept in cars between shifts and sometimes on cots in the plant parking lot. They did the repetitive, focused work that allowed a 1,000-plane strategy to exist. Their pride carried them. "We knew we were building something important," a riveter named Monroe said years later. "Every rivet we drove was going to help end the war." The simple dignity of that comment cuts through any technical discussion about output. For the German pilots, the opposite emotion predominated: humiliation and grief. Luftwaffe men who saw those bomber streams knew they were being outmatched, not by heroics but by industry. By April 20th, 1945, in a ruined Berlin, American officers found a final German intelligence report on Willow Run, dated Hitler's last birthday. It read like a lament. "We reported this truth 2 years ago. We were not believed." That line distilled the tragedy. Not that German intelligence failed to collect facts, but that the political culture punished truth that contradicted myth. Those who had tried to warn their country paid in reputation or life. Some were executed for other reasons, some silenced by removal, and some fled into exile with the memory of the knowledge they had been forbidden to act on. What does this teach beyond history? It teaches that production capacity can be decisive. It teaches that systems of belief can blind nations to the arithmetic of their fate. And it teaches that people who see inconvenient truths can be as helpless as anyone against the inertia of a culture that will not change. The men who gathered the evidence were not visionary in the romantic sense. They were accountants of war, technicians who watched a calculus sweep away strategy. They were losers in a moral sense before their country lost militarily. They understood the cost of speaking. They knew the price of silence. The story of Willow Run, of film burned to avoid accusation, of saboteurs surrendering rather than lie, and of men counted at desks and in the sky, is a story about the terrible difference between knowing and being believed. It is a human story with global consequences. The math was simple, the refusal to accept it was not. April 20th, 1945. In a burned room in Berlin, amid rubble and ash, American officers found a final German intelligence report on Willow Run. The heading was simple. The last line was a quiet, terrible confession. "We reported this truth 2 years ago. We were not believed." Those 7 words are a knot of failure and sorrow. They do not tell the whole story, but they tell the core of it. Knowledge existed inside the Reich, and belief did not follow. This is not a story about villains who did not know. It is a story about people who did know, and were denied the right to act on what they knew. It is the tale of Wilhelm Canaris, Nikolaus Ritter, Werner Zahn, Otto Ohlendorf, Albert Speer, George John Dash, and many others who stood at desks with manifests, film and photographs, and saw a future the rulers refused to accept. They were not traitors to their country, in the simple sense. Some opposed the regime for moral reasons. Others remained loyal men of the state, who simply wanted to prepare their nation for reality. In that mixture of motives are ordinary human beings, professionals bound by duty, pride, and fear. After the war, numbers became undeniable. Willow Run built 8,685 B-24s. American B-24 production totaled 18,188. The United States produced 303,617 aircraft from 1940 to 1945. German output could not match those figures while fighting on multiple fronts. The arithmetic is blunt, but the arithmetic was present at the time. It was not hidden. Abwehr agents compiled evidence from Mexico City napkins, from Spanish diplomatic films, from aerial photographs and railroad manifests. These were precise data points: parking lots with 12,000 cars, aluminum tonnages measured in millions of pounds, tooling investments that dwarfed entire German programs. Those data did not require belief. They required attention. They required leaders willing to change plans to accommodate truths that hurt pride. What made the difference was not collection, but acceptance. Leadership chose narrative over numbers. They chose to preserve a myth of superiority rather than confront the practical consequences of democratic production. That choice was a moral act. It was also a political and military one. To prefer image to calculation is to trade survival for dignity. The Reich paid a terrible price for that trade. Cities burned, millions died, and countless lives were truncated because men in power could not let go of a world that made sense to them. The perspective of losers is often simple and human. For officers like Canaris, the loss began long before the final bombardment. It started the day they realized that telling the truth endangered them. It was present when they watched a film of a mile-long assembly line and burned it because the regime would call it forgery and then kill the messenger. It was in the confession of George John Dash, who came ashore to sabotage and instead surrendered because the reality he knew made sabotage pointless. He wanted his captors to know what Berlin would not accept. These are painful choices. They are the choices of people trapped between conscience and survival. Consider Albert Speer. He was not a man of conscience in the easy sense. He had been an architect of the regime's machinery, yet his diaries and post-war testimony show a man who understood the arithmetic before Hitler did. He wrote of the terror of acknowledging industrial truth to a leader for whom truth was a threat. Speer's despair is not merely about failure of policy. It is about being unable to persuade those who could save others by altering course. For Speer and others, understanding the scale of Allied production meant seeing their own nation drawn toward ruin and feeling powerless to stop it, because admitting reality would mean admitting error. There are many small human facts that make this history intimate. Women like Rosie Munro, who left kitchens to learn rivet guns, sleeping between shifts in the factory parking lot, are part of a long ledger of ordinary courage. Black workers, boys of 16, disabled employees, people who had been excluded in many societies, became the backbone of a production that defeated a regime posing as a hierarchy of worth. Their work was invisible in wartime headlines, but decisive in outcome. When you count aircraft, you must also count the hands that made them, and those hands were diverse, determined, and ordinary. After the war, many of the German officers who had warned were left with a bitter legacy. Some were executed for unrelated plots or crimes. Some fled, haunted by the knowledge they had been forbidden to speak in time. Others stayed and carried the memory of ignored evidence as a private grief. Their stories matter not to excuse the crimes of the regime, but to understand how human systems fail. It is important to see that the denial that protected dictators also destroyed the nation that embraced them. Why does this matter to us now? Because the lesson is universal and urgent. Institutions can collect the right facts and still be blinded by ideology. When leaders build their identity on a single story and punish dissent, the society loses the ability to adapt. This is not a remote historical curiosity. It is the mechanism that underlies many modern failures in policy, business, and community life. When inconvenient truths are labeled treason, when whistleblowers are punished, the only voices left are those that reinforce comfort. The result is often slow catastrophe. History gives us a raw instrument for judgment, data, and results. Willow Run and the scale of American production are not arguments about virtue. They are demonstrations of what organized, diversified labor and investment can produce. They are evidence that systems that include a broad cross-section of people and that reward truth above myth are resilient. The German leaders' refusal to accept their own intelligence turned a professional tragedy into an existential one. To write this is not to deny the moral horror of the Nazi regime. The crimes are monstrous and must never be softened. To bring the loser's perspective is not to sympathize with atrocity, but to recover the human truth of how arrogance and ideology can undo a nation. It is to honor those who, within a corrupt system, tried to stop disaster by counting and warning. It is to learn that honesty in institutions matters as much as bravery in battle. If there is a final human image from this story, it is not a map of losses or a stack of manifests. It is a quiet desk, a man with a cigarette, a film burned in a tin pail, and a report left unread on a table. It is the face of a riveter at dawn, wiping sweat from her brow and heading back for another shift. It is the look of a pilot counting enemy planes in the sky and knowing the war was being decided by production, not destiny. Think about that image the next time you hear a leader deny an inconvenient fact. Think about the men and women who counted and the cost they paid when nobody listened. Ask yourself what your role is when evidence collides with belief. Will you speak? Will your institution reward truth? Will you press the red button that alerts others to a fact they would rather ignore? If this story moved you, if it pushed you to reflect, please help our channel keep telling hard, honest history. Click the red subscribe button, like this video, and leave a comment with your thoughts or questions. If you prefer privacy, share your reflections anonymously. We read and value every voice. Your engagement keeps this memory alive and helps others learn the lesson that the courage to believe inconvenient truth may one day save lives.